and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on international news brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and in today's episode, we bring to you the latest from Sudan, the prospects of the Iran nuclear deal, and a response to The Economist's declaration of Italy as their country of the year. Now, our first story is from Sudan, where protests have continued continuously since October 25th, when the military staged a coup against the transitional government it was a part of. The latest round of protests took place on Saturday, which marks 2 months since the coup. We have with us Prashant for the latest on this. Prashant, if you could take us through what happened on Saturday.
Right, Swastika. So the protests on Saturday were on, like you said, on December 25th, which is 2 months since the coup took place. And there have also been a series of protests going on over the past many days because December 19th was also the anniversary of the Sudanese revolution of 2018, the anniversary when it broke out.
Okay.
We know that the revolution broke out in 2018. In April 2019, Omar al-Bashir, who was the target of the protesters, was overthrown. So, it's been a series of protests, multiple protest sit-ins, gatherings. There has been very heavy repression, of course. In fact, the police are believed, security forces are believed to have fired tear gas on the crowd.
Okay.
The Doctors Association in Sudan has reported a number of casualties. Apparently, there's been firing even at the hospitals over the course of the past few days. So there is relentless repression going on in the sense that there is an attempt to there were many attempts to prevent protesters from gathering at a central point, not only on Saturday but on earlier days as well.
Okay.
Earlier, there was also reports that the internet had been severely restricted, which is what took place immediately after October 25th as well, when the military coup took place, because the internet was completely brought down to prevent the kind of not only communication among protesters, but also visuals of the repression of the protest coming out. So what we've seen is that this wave of repression going on, very systematic repression. There are reports that the army has also been brought in to curb some of the protests. So what we're seeing right now, in some senses, is a continuing trend from October 25th onwards, of any attempt by popular mobilizations to curb attempts by popular mobilizations. The important thing to note is that the spirit on the streets continues to be very strong. The people have not been deterred by these kind of repressive acts. They're continuously taking to the streets, marching in Khartoum and in other cities, especially Khartoum important because it's the capital. It is also one of the places where the regime is at its most powerful. But nonetheless, we see that the protests have continued with a great deal of force, and we can definitely expect that in the coming days and weeks as well, this is not going to stop, this is going to continue. And the Sudanese army and its collaborators in the civilian system are not going to have an easy way ahead in imposing this structure that they've been imposing since October 25th.
Prashant, the process in Sudan is quite crucial for the entire region. If you could tell us a little bit more about where Sudan stands as of today.
Right, so just to take our viewers back a bit, we do know that the October 25th coup took place. The military led by Lieutenant General Burhan overthrew the civilian government, or actually it is a mixed government. So, but that structure which he himself was part of was overthrown by the military. So, highly ironic. And this was something that the movements had been warning for a very long time. Because in November, Lieutenant General Burhan was set to hand over his position as head of what was called a Sovereignty Council to a civilian person. So a lot of people had warned from the very beginning that the military would not give up power that easily, right? And this whole interim structure was supposed to lead to an election some years down the line. So there was a big question as to whether the military would actually give up this position, and it would actually seek to further strengthen its position and its control over Sudan by trying to remove the civilian political parties who were associated with it in that government. And that is exactly what happened. Like, for the longest time, certain sections of the civilian authority had thought that they could somehow strike a deal with the military, have this joint structure which was there.
Okay.
From 2019 onwards, that structure had been there, a joint civilian military structure. And they thought that they could somehow sustain the joint structure and kind of keep the military happy and continue this. So there will be at least some civilian participation. But what happened after that is that, of course, we know that all the parties were removed. In November, the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok was restored to his position as Prime Minister. But there was a catch here. The fact is that he was made head of a civilian technocratic government, which means none of the political parties had representation. So the political parties, even the centrist political parties, or even maybe the conservative political parties, not the protesters on the street, even those parties were actually removed from the position of being in power, or position of having a share in power. So what Sudan has right now is it's a completely military-controlled government of technocrats with a civilian figurehead. And this is very important to note, and this is what the protesters on the street have been condemning. They have been very critical of this idea that, there is some kind of, that people are willing to see this as a civilian government, when it's not the case. And the military has a stranglehold not only on the governing structures, but also on the economy of Sudan and the foreign policy of Sudan. So the military controls everything that's really important in the structure, right? So this is what the protesters have been taking to the streets against. And it's unfortunate, however, that, the United States, or even the United Nations for that matter, have basically pretty much accepted this framework, which is completely against what the protesters have been demanding for years. It is against the promise of the December 2018 revolution. It is against the demands of that revolution. And it is against what the protesters have been demanding for the longest time, right? So what we're seeing here basically is a complete betrayal of that process, and they're very clear that this international acceptance is not going to change their mind. So the protesters are continuing to take to the streets. It has foreign policy implications also, because the Sudanese army is a close ally of Israel. It's a close ally of the Gulf powers. It acts as their enforcer, and this has actually helped the processes of Israel and Saudi Arabia and all these countries in the region, because the Sudanese army is a very strong ally of theirs, right? So this is the situation right now. So I think in the coming weeks and months, we'll be seeing far more protests, far more intense protests. And like I said earlier in the last answer, the army is not going to have an easy time.
Well, thank you for those details, and we will keep an eye on the developments here. Moving on to our next story, which is about the Iran nuclear deal. The 8th round of talks is beginning in Vienna today. The talks have reached a crucial juncture, with the Western powers making threatening noises as well as stating that time is short. Meanwhile, Iran has made it clear that sanctions relief is a key point ahead of going forward. Now, Prashant spoke to NewsClick's Prabir Purkayastha ahead of the talks. Here is what he had to say.
So in this context, of course, the other key question, like you said, is of what is the agenda of the United States and Israel. One of the key aspects has been to further tighten restrictions in Iran. We talked about earlier how they want to restrict Iran's role in the region. They want to impose further control on Iran's missile program, for instance. So are these issues still, do they look like these issues are also playing in the background, or are they still on the agenda as well?
Well, as far as Iran is concerned, they're not on the agenda. They never were. So the JCPOA was supposed to be restricted to a specific part, which is really the nuclear arrangement within Iran. And therefore, linking the sanctions that the US has imposed on the basis of nuclear program of Iran, basically those sanctions to be lifted. Now, this is the limited, shall we say, brief that the JCPOA has. So linking regional role that Iran plays, asking them to give up a certain kind of technology, missiles for example, is really asking Iran's sovereignty to be given up.
Right.
Now that no self-respecting country is going to accept, and Iran is not Iraq. It is a much bigger country. It has much more capability, and each day it in fact increases its technological capability. It makes military action that much more difficult. And after Afghanistan, for the American people to believe there is a military option in Iran would be rather stupid. But of course, stupidity is something which people may not have, but it doesn't mean the strategic establishment in the United States and Israel will not have. They may have stupidity, and they seem to have showed this time and again. We have the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraq invasion, right. We had the attack on Libya, destroying Libya and Syria. We have all the consequences thereof. Do they want another failed state in Iran? I think that is a disaster for the world as well as for them. The other part of it is that it's not going to be easy to militarily destroy Iran's nuclear program, even if they want to bomb it out of existence, because without an occupation of Iran, it doesn't seem that's possible. Right. Because they have hardened bunkers, they have really fortified what they're doing, this deep underground. So it's not going to be easy to destroy whatever the Iranians' nuclear facilities are. And Iran has a very good missile force capability, as we have seen. They have also their allies in the region who also have a lot of missile capacity. So this is really playing with destruction at a very large level. So I don't know what the Americans are thinking, why Biden would not straight away walk into the JCPOA, lift sanction, normalize relations, blaming it on Trump. Why was he trying to play hardball? And it does appear that the Israel influence in the American establishment and the American media does play a big role. And it appears that the Americans tend to follow Israel's lead or rather accept Israel's concerns as far more important than its own concerns should be in the region, or at least of its own other allies in the region.
Right. And Prabir, finally, what about the other signatories? We have, of course, Russia and China who have been playing a very important role in this. European countries, since 2018, making a lot of noises about how they want the deal to be sort of brought back, but actually doing very little concretely when it comes to this and often towing the United States line.
You know, the only issue that is there is if sanctions have to be lifted, the European countries have very little role, because essentially the American sanctions are the ones that operate. As we know, the financial world operates on the dollar, and therefore if America doesn't lift sanctions, no other country can really do much except Russia and China, who have entered essentially into barter deals with Iran, and therefore they're able to handle this American sanctions, and they don't really accept American sanctions on Iran. But for other countries, they're just too enmeshed economically, financially with the United States to take an independent position. That's why when they rejected America's walking out of JCPOA and said, we will try to be in the JCPOA and continue relations with Iran, they could not really do anything as far as economic relationships go, because essentially even German companies and banks, for example, were not willing to enter into any deal with the Iranians. So that is the basic issue. And this we have seen in India also. When the Reserve Bank of India, State Bank of India was threatened that if you touch Iran, then all your external transactions would come under American sanctions. So I think this is the key issue that is the Gordian knot for the Europeans. And I don't see any will to do anything about it as yet. So I think we are going to see, I'm relatively, shall I say, much more pessimistic about a resolution now coming about. I think they had a window 6 or 8 months back. They could have done it very quickly. I think more they have delayed, more they have built up expectations of delivering a better deal, both in the United States and in Iran. And at the moment, the gap seems to be too wide. Right. So for me, doesn't look like we are going to have the deal. I think it is the shall we say, teetering on the edge for quite some time now on West Asia, and particularly with Iran, Israel, this axis supported, of course, on one side by the United States and backed up, not militarily but otherwise, by Russia and China, to see that Iran doesn't sink as a country, as an economy. I think this is what we're going to continue unless good sense dawns on Israel, who are the real drivers, it seems, of the American policies. But that is a hard call, because Israel is also, as you know, because of its electoral scenario, everybody is doing gamemanship over there. Exactly. Who can one-up other Naftali Bennett or Netanyahu? You have the same kind of scenario. So I think we are in an unstable equilibrium with no signs of it moving towards a stable equilibrium as of now.
And finally, the famous magazine, The Economist, has chosen Italy as its country of the year. Among the reasons cited was the stability under technocratic Prime Minister Mario Draghi, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic recovery. However, many sections in Italy do not agree with this diagnosis. We talked to Maurizio Coppola of the party Power to the People on this, and he seems to disagree. Now, here's why. Listen in.
First of all, the Economist edition of December 18 declared Italy as their country of the year for 3 reasons mainly. First of all, the new Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, is a responsible and confident person that gave back international recognition to Italy after decades of non-international recognition due also to prime ministers as Silvio Berlusconi, for example. A second reason is like the rapid economic recovery Italy is living in this post-pandemic situation. And third, the management of the pandemic. Why Italy is not our country of the year? Because first of all, Mario Draghi was not elected by the people as a prime minister, but it was imposed by the president Sergio Mattarella when the former prime minister Conte was in crisis with the coalition. So there was no elections in February 2021, and this translated itself also in like a growing distance between the popular needs, the people's needs, and the political institutional processes. This detachment is causing huge divergences inside of the Italian society. Then also a second thing is that on beginning of December, the unions called for a general strike against the measures of Mario Draghi, because the budget bill he was to implement didn't contain any welfare redistribution measures for the working people. So the unions, even the bigger unions that in general are very aligned to the government's line, decided to call for a general strike, and every party of the parliament that is supporting Mario Draghi criticized the general strike. And the day after, they vote against legislative proposals, against relocations. They are against minimum wages. So there is no way, there is no urgency for the Italian government to respond to the social needs of the working people. And on the other side, they criticize every political action unions and leftist parties are taking. Then we can talk about the economic recovery. We have always to ask, for whom is this economic recovery? Italy, okay, the recovery of 2021 is very high. Also, the European Commission is predicting an over 6% economic recovery for Italy. But first of all, Italy had also a very big crash of economy during 2020. So the recovery is not so high as it is presented. And secondly, exactly the question I asked before, for whom? We have always to ask for whom the economic recovery is. And there are at least two elements that shows that there is an economic recovery for the private companies and for the rich and not for the working class. The first element is that Italy in the last 30 years, it's the only OECD country that wages dropped in the last 30 years by around 3% in 30 years. And this means also that the working poor, so people working every day, waking up every day to go to the workplace, they are poor. This percentage of the working people who is poor rise from 26 to 33% in 30 years. A second element, the people dying at the workplace is rising every year. We have today 3 people per day dying at the workplace. In the first 10 months of 2021 in Italy, there are over 1,000 people dying at the workplace. And why is this like this? Because the stress, the pressure at the workplace is increasing, because the labor inspectorate does not have the power to punish also companies not respecting labor security standards and so on. And Mario Draghi, concerning the wages, concerning the security at the workplace, is not doing anything to improve the situation of working people. And at the end, we can talk about the COVID-19 pandemic in Italy. Of course, Italy has a very high vaccination rate compared to the other countries, but there is also other huge problems. That the pandemic now in this next wave we are living is hitting very hard. Yesterday we had a new record with over 55,000 people infected only in one day, and 144 people dying. Why is it like this? Because the healthcare system is under stress. A healthcare system that in the last 20 years lived dismantlement. We have like the GDP part going to the healthcare decreased from 2010 to 2020 from 7 to 6.3%. We have in Italy, there are 4,000 doctors missing in the healthcare institutions. There are 10,000 first aid nurses missing, and there are 54,000 healthcare workers working with precarious contracts. So this is a situation where the healthcare system is under stress when a pandemic, when an emergency is falling on the healthcare system. And we have to say that all European Union post-pandemic recovery plan that now Mario Draghi is implementing in Italy does not go to the roots of these problems. And this is the reason why we said that Italy is not our country of the year and Mario Draghi is not our Prime Minister of the year.
That's all we have at Daily Debrief today. Do come back to us tomorrow and keep watching People's Dispatch.